when Ronald Reagan was elected? The answer is 30%. 30% is completely comfortable. That's like the person with the $50,000 debt who's making millions. No big deal. 50%, yeah, getting up there. Angela Merkel and all her years in Germany, and there's a lot of research to back this up, says that 60% was the limit. And that's what the Maastricht Treaty that created the European Union and the European Central Bank, that was their goal. They said, don't go over 60%. If you do, you're expected to take measures, raise taxes or, reduce debt or reduce spending, do something to get that back down under 60%. What's the critical threshold where, water turns to steam or water turns to ice or something changes in such a way that it's not the same? It's radically different, but it happens very quickly. The best research says the answer is 90%. And your debt to GDP ratio goes to over 90%. Your multiplier of an additional debt goes below 1. So just to put that in context, at 30%, if I borrow $1 and spend $1, I might get $1.30 of growth. Assuming you spend it wisely. That's a big condition, but you borrow $1 and spend $1 and get $1.30 of growth. Okay, the debt was productive if you put it to good use. That $1.30 gets smaller and smaller. As you get closer to 90%, it goes to $1.20, $1.10, $1.05. Past 90%, you borrow $1 and you spend $1 and you only get 95 cents of growth. You don't get your dollar back in terms of GDP. And then 90% and 85%, et cetera. So 90% is the critical threshold. The US is at 131%. Highest in history, which means we are well past the point where you can borrow your way to growth, where you can borrow your way out of a debt crisis. And we were heading for a debt crisis. Now, debt crises of that magnitude, by the way, if you ask a separate question, say, well, who else is at that lunch table? Who else has a debt to GDP ratio of about 130% or higher? The answer is Lebanon, Greece, Italy. Those are your mates at the lunch table. That's where the United States is. Now, Stephanie Kelton, she's the big brain of modern monetary theory. She's a professor at State University of New York. She says it doesn't matter. They always point to Japan. Japan is at 280%, way past any member of the peer group. China's probably higher. China's a little more opaque because they are, but also they don't have as much national debt. If you look at the national debt to GDP, it's modest, but they have an enormous amount of provincial debt, and the banking system is owned by the government or controlled by the government. When you throw in the bank debt, the state-owned enterprises, the provincial debt, and the government, so that's the real national debt. I was in south of Nanjing. They had these ghost cities. I went out to see them. They're real in the sense that, it's steel and glass and copper and cement and asphalt, and they got country clubs and hotels and luxury apartment buildings, etc. And then you look down the horizon, not too far, maybe 7-8 miles, there's another one. And then in the distance, there's another one. They're all empty. They're all empty. But you can create 20,000 jobs for 2 years if you do something like that, or 3 years or longer, but all that money's wasted. That's kind of, tells you a lot about China. But the point being, it was all debt financed and a lot else besides. Stephanie Kelton says it doesn't matter because you're borrowing in your own currency. So if you're Argentine and you borrow in dollars and you print pesos, how are you going to pay the dollars back unless you have, huge trade surpluses, which they don't. So they just default. Argentina is a serial defaulter and everyone expects that. If you borrow in dollars and you print dollars, which the United States does, they're like, what's the problem? Just print the dollars and pay the money back. Well, that's true. If you print dollars, there's no reason to default on dollar debt because you actually can print the money and buy the bonds. But it doesn't mean nothing else bad happens. What about inflation or hyperinflation? What about a foreign exchange rate? The exchange rate can collapse. And these modern monetary theorists show very little understanding of the international aspects. They treat the U.S. like a closed economy, which it's not. If it were a closed economy and we didn't have to worry about trade deficits, trade surpluses, capital flows, exchange rates, foreign credit, China owning $1 trillion of U.S. Treasury securities, which they do. If you didn't have to worry about any of that, I think they'd probably still be wrong, but they'd have a better case. But you do. She says, well, we don't really need a bond market, U.S. bond market. We only have a bond market as a favor to investors because it gives them a place to put their money. They say when inflation happens, raise taxes. By the way, they also say you don't need a tax system because if you can just print the money, why do you have to collect taxes? And their answer is, we collect taxes to redistribute income. Okay, well, at least they're honest. That's kind of a socialist model, but they're honest about it. If you ask the typical member of Congress to define modern monetary theory, they'll look at you funny. They've either never heard of it or they certainly don't know what it means, MMT, They're acting in accordance with modern monetary theory. Whether they know it or not doesn't matter. The actual behavior, just go back to COVID. as we talked about the debt to GDP ratio. So Trump put through a $2 trillion COVID relief package. And that was when, the Paycheck Protection Plan, that was $800 billion, and everyone got the $1,200 check. And then at the end of December, at the very end of the Trump administration, they did another $1 trillion almost. And that's when everyone got the $600 checks. And now you're up to $1,800. By the way, those checks, that is helicopter money. What the Fed does is nonsense. But when it's fiscal policy, not monetary policy, and you're handing out checks, that is helicopter money. And credit to Larry Summers for saying, you're going to get inflation out of this. Well, Biden comes into office in January 2021, and he's like, not to be outdone. He did his own COVID relief package. That was another $2 trillion. And that's when we all got the $1,400 checks. They handed them out. And then later that year, they did the $1 trillion infrastructure package. And then, just to top it off, what we get recently was the just under $1 trillion Green New Deal. I call it the Green New Scam. And the baseline budget deficit, before everything I just described, the baseline budget deficit was about $1 trillion a year. So take $1 trillion for 2020, 2021, add on, $2 trillion for Trump's first package, $1 trillion for his second one, $2 trillion for Biden's first package, $1 trillion for the Green New Scam, I think $1 trillion for infrastructure. That's $7 trillion on top of the $2 trillion baseline budget deficit. So that's $9 trillion piled on top of what was at the time about a $21 trillion national debt. So that's how we got to $30 trillion. That's how the ratio went from 106 to 131. These numbers are mind-boggling, and MMT says it doesn't matter. But it does matter, and it shows up the way I described earlier, which is it slows growth. You don't get growth. So best case for the U.S. is very slow, weak growth, which we saw from 2009 to 2019. Worst case is you throw a recession on top of that, which we're heading for, and the U.S. will be in fiscal distress. What was new beginning in 1989 was supply chain science. And it's a combination of algorithms, applied mathematics, increased computing power, linear programming, and other techniques that could expand and extend the supply chains greater than had ever been done before. And enormously, and a lot of it, people know about just-in-time inventory. Like, I got a car assembly line, I got to put in the seats. I want the seats to show up like the morning that car gets to that point on the assembly line. So it's not sitting in a warehouse, not inventory, cuts costs, etc. Walmart invented something called cross-docking. What's that? Well, it used to be a truck went to warehouse, unloaded, and another truck pulled up, and you loaded the truck, and it went away. Well, Walmart said, why don't we just go from truck to truck, skip the warehouse? And that's called cross-docking. And then a Walmart store or Home Depot or Lowe's or, others, the store is the warehouse. I mean, the reason they're so big is because they're warehouses. So it was like, okay, let's cut out the warehouse, etc. Let's go to China for cheaper labor. Let's consolidate our number of shipping lanes. Well, all that was done, and a lot more, for one reason, which was to cut costs, transportation costs, labor costs, energy costs, inventory costs, financing costs, etc. The problem was there was a hidden cost. While they were cutting all these visible costs and reducing the cost to the end consumer, there was a hidden cost, which was they were making the thing more and more frail, less resilient, less robust, etc., to the point where if one section broke down, the whole thing collapsed. I give an example like a loaf of bread. It's like, hey, I got a loaf of bread at the store. Maybe you don't now because of what's going on. Well, okay, but a loaf of bread comes from a baker. It needs a wrapper. They're going to be plastic or paper. It had to get there by a truck. Trucker had to take the bread from the baker to the distribution center or the store. The truck needs diesel. You need a truck driver. Someone's got to make the truck. Let's go over to the baker. Baked in an oven. Where'd the oven come from? Where did the manufacturer get the tempered glass and steel to build the oven? And you need energy to run the oven. And by the way, where did the baker get the flour? Got it from the mill. Where did the mill get it? They got it from a farmer who grew the wheat. It also had to be transported by train or truck from the farm to the mill. And then the farmer needs a tractor and diesel and harvesters and by the way, nitrogen fertilizer, which comes from Russia, etc. So the point being, there's an immense supply chain in a loaf of bread. When you go through, wrapper, baker, ingredients, wheat, farmer, transportation, et cetera, et cetera. And every link in that supply chain has its own supply chains of, where trucking firms get the truck drivers, et cetera. I came to the conclusion that the supply chain is not part of the economy. The supply chain is the economy. There's nothing you can think of that doesn't have a supply chain behind it. Now, that's true. And then you stretch these things immensely to cut costs. You've created enormous fragility. And I'll give you a real concrete example.